All right, welcome everyone to another Suffer.net cross-platform user group. We have been doing this for a while. I was telling Ed that Les was having this meetup here in person for a long time, and after a while, he basically needed a new organizer. So we have been now. Let me just take a quick look. Now it's there. So we have been doing this for a while. So we already have here in the meetup, we have talked about Blazor, we have talked about Avalonia, we have talked about Uno, we have talked about deploying and scaling, we have talked about Maui Blazor, Blazor architecture, and so on. But one of the things that I know, if you guys have the same issue that I do, is I started web development with Blazor. I was always a desktop and a Xamarin guy. So Blazor was the one who bring me to the web and make it really easy, make it really like I understand how to do things because I was used to use Charts, to use Visual Studio, to use my environment. And I started with XAML, meaning that when I got to the HTML world and I have to see a lot of div and make sure that CSS make it look beautiful, it was always a hassle with me. So funny enough, I watched this talk for Ed and I got a lot of great insight. I'm not going to spoil anything. I'm going to let Ed introduce himself. I know everyone here knows him. We have been waiting for this talk for a while. Ed was kind enough to reschedule. So thank you for joining on. Ed, I'm going to pass to you to introduce yourself, and then we can get started. I think that you are in mute, Ed. You're on mute. Let me see.
There we go.
Perfect.
I'm not used to Zoom. I was trying to find the unmute button. Let's see. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen as well. There we go. Let me get some of this junk off of here and get Zoom out of my way. All right. So let me refresh this as well. So I'm Ed Charbeneau. I'm a principal developer advocate for Progress Software. You might recognize our brand Telerik. We make the Telerik UI for Blazor UI components. So we have like over 100 components for Blazor, and they're all customizable and support theming, charts, graphs, data grids, data visualizations, all sorts of cool stuff. And I've been working on that project for about 5 years now, since Blazor was introduced. And I've actually been with the company for 7 years and doing web development for 20 years. So absolutely love web. And I'm pretty fluent with HTML, CSS, JavaScript, C#. And this is one of the places that I really like to work in the web, is on the whole design and programming aspect of it. So this is a really fun talk for me to give. I like to talk about like the entire scope of CSS in the context of Blazor. I'm going to start off with a little bit of Sass talk. So just kind of giving you a brief overview of what Sass is and how it integrates and works well with Blazor, and where it might not work as well. I have some tips and tricks too on how to get that integrated into your projects really easy with .NET. It's something that I think documentation falls really short on out there. Then we'll talk about CSS isolation. This is a Blazor specific feature. All the major web frameworks have this feature these days, but Blazor has its own implementation of CSS isolation. And there's certain scenarios that it works well with and some that it doesn't. So we'll talk about how to use that. Then we'll talk about managing scope with CSS. So we don't really talk about scope management so much in the CSS world, but Blazor opens up some new possibilities, and there's some new features in the CSS spec that allow us to actually do scope management. I think it's really unique to Blazor, and it has some really cool use cases. And I had some folks that were talking about joining from Wells Fargo. I don't know if they're here today, but they were asking specifically about some of these features, and I'll try to answer those questions, whether they come or not. Hopefully those questions get answered, because that's what this talk is all about, seeing how to integrate all of these different solutions together. And then we'll chat a little bit about frameworks at the very end. We'll talk about Tailwind and Bootstrap, what the differences are between those, and how they kind of play into the big picture. Before I get too far into the presentation, I do want to point out that the presentation itself is a Blazor application. So I'll pull up the Solution Explorer here, and we'll take a quick look at what we have up on the screen. And this is actually one of those type of presentations where the slides are the app and the app is the presentations. And the presentation itself uses all of the techniques that I talk about in the presentation to actually build out the slides. So if you look in the application here, you'll see that we have some theming built with Sass and CSS. We have Razor or Blazor components that are either samples within the slides themselves. So a lot of these are samples. And then we have kind of the different layouts in the slides. And the actual slides themselves are Razor components. So what's nice about this is after the talk, you can go out to my GitHub page, clone the repo, and not only do you have all the slides for the talk, but you can dig in to the code that's supplied with it and see that there is examples baked into the presentation itself of how to do all of these things, along with CSS code that's making it look nice. So keep that in mind while you see the presentation, that there's CSS and HTML behind all of this, and you have access to it on my GitHub page. So that's kind of the agenda of what we're going to talk about. We'll start off with a little bit of what is CSS. And I also want to pull chat up here in case anybody has any questions. Feel free to type those into chat, and I'll try to get them as we go, or if they're really in depth, I'll try to save them towards the end, but at least I can address them if they're there in chat. So first of all, what is Sass? Sass is a superset of CSS. So it's like a language extension to CSS. And what's nice is Sass is compatible with CSS. So any CSS is actually runnable as Sass. And what Sass does is it gives us additional language features that CSS doesn't have. And then we can compile that out to CSS code. The Sass compiler itself was originally written with JavaScript, and later on they moved that source code over to Dart. So it actually can be used without any JavaScript tooling whatsoever. Most of the samples that you see online, it talks about using npm to install the Sass compiler and running it through something like Webpack or some other JavaScript tooling to get an output. But this has been modernized quite a bit, and there's just not a lot of blog posts out there talking about it. But the Dart Sass is just an executable now that you can just download onto your machine and use it directly. So what's nice about Sass is it brought us some features that we didn't have with CSS before. CSS is catching up quite a bit, but one of the things that we used to not be able to do is define variables in CSS. And this can be super helpful when we're creating multiple themes for our websites. Dark theme, light theme is a big popular thing right now. And supplying two different themes to your website used to be difficult, and that's made a lot easier with variables. Now, we do have variables in CSS now, and I'll talk a little bit about that later on in another module here. But Sass even takes that a step further and lets you scope the variables and do a lot more with them. There's more functionality as to how you can process those variables too. In current CSS, they're kind of just set them and get them. In SAS, you can actually run different functions on them, do calculations, do color changes, all sorts of stuff. So it gives you a lot more functionality than just bare bones SAS does. It also has a concept called mix-ins. And you could think of these as a function that you run that returns a set of CSS code. So you can pass in variables to this function and get back chunks of CSS code, or just one line of CSS code back, or even just a variable back. So they're really flexible and let you build like a plug and play system of CSS modules. So SAS is super handy. It's getting to the point where CSS is catching up, and one day we won't need SAS anymore. But for the time being, it looks like it's here to stay. So when should you use something like SAS? If you want to build like application-wide theming. A good example of that is for these slides, I have the ability to change the entire theme of the app just by changing between light, dark, and high contrast. You could do that with SAS because of the variables aspect of it. You can do advanced math and color transformations and things like that, which help you take a base set of colors and just transform those into, say, a dark theme. The mix-in utilities, the functionality of that lets you break things down into smaller modules. It makes things a lot easier to manage. If you're using Bootstrap, Bootstrap was initially built with SAS. I think it's optional these days with the latest version of Bootstrap, but SAS allows you to trim down what you're not using with Bootstrap. And it also adds some functionality as to how you can theme things as well. So that actually plays really well together. What it's also good for is theming non-Blazor elements. We'll get into what CSS isolation is in a little bit, but if you're trying to theme non-Blazor things, things on your website that aren't components, stuff that's outside the scope of Blazor itself, SAS can be super helpful there as well. I talked a little bit about how it's easier to install than most people let on. And there's a lot of blog posts out there that if you search for how to install SAS, you're going to get some sort of recipe from the JavaScript world that involves NPM and probably Webpack. But it's actually really easy to install without those things. If you're on Windows, you can just install it with Chocolatey. If you're on a Mac, you can use Brew, and you just simply type install SAS in either Chocolatey or Brew to get the compiler on your machine. And that's like a global tool that's runnable from anywhere. And then once you have it, you just type run SAS and give it an input file with the SAS format, and then an output file with the CSS file name, and it'll output the compiled SAS there. If you do want to use the Node.js toolchain, so NPM and all of that, if you already have NPM in your application, in your toolchain, then why not? You can go ahead and just type npm install global SAS and just get it that way. And it's very easy to run as well. You just do npx SAS, and again, it's a simple input and output. And that's all it really takes to set up SAS and run it, is about 2 lines of code. So all of those blog posts out there that have these huge configurations with Webpack and how to integrate all of these things, completely unnecessary. It's gotten so much easier these days. It's literally just 2 lines of code. You can also integrate it with MS Build pretty easy. You can open up your CS proj file and just add the targets, the build targets for it, and when you want the SAS compiler to run. So you can run this when you're debugging at release time, and set different options up for each of those as well. But it's pretty easy to get going within the context of MS Build. So again, you're going to see lots of documentation out there for things like Webpack, Gulp, Grunt, and other JavaScript frameworks not a lot out there for Blazor, and it's really pretty easy to do inside the .NET ecosystem. And again, if you're using the node tooling, there's lots of docs out there, but it's pretty easy to get up and running. You just add the script to compile the Sass code right into your scripts section of your package.json file, and you're up and running. Again, take advantage of the best parts of Sass. Use Sass modules to organize your code. I have a little sample over here of how that's done typically in an application. Break it up just like you would components in a Blazor application. So if you have a particular component, you can just isolate the CSS for that component with the feature that it goes with. I like to split up things like the type base, all of my type that's in the application, any of the errors and validation that are provided by the application, things like that. Bootstrap is actually a really good example for how to organize a project with Sass. They've done a fantastic job into breaking up all of their components in the CSS that belongs with them. And there's a nice little tool that you can install that's going to help you as well. If you're inclined to using Visual Studio, you don't want to leave Visual Studio to run things at the command line. You don't have to. If you install the Task Runner Explorer extension, this is up on the Visual Studio Marketplace. It's the NPM Task Runner. Just hit download and put that in your project, and you get a nice GUI inside of your project that will find any NPM tooling that's there and run scripts right from Visual Studio. All right, so that's a little bit of an overview about Sass. I want to talk about more CSS stuff that is web standard now, things that we don't need to install additional tooling for. And we're going to talk about that in the context of Blazor as well. So Blazor adds some things on top of those web standards that helps us write scoped CSS based on which components they belong with, and they call that CSS isolation. And what CSS isolation does is it lets us define styles to where they won't be affected by the global namespace. And this avoids style conflicts. So if if you just write CSS code and you're not paying attention to namespaces, you can accidentally override things. It's just the nature of CSS. It has that cascading effect to it, hence the name, cascading style sheets. So it's easy to step on your own toes sometimes with CSS. So what Blazor does is it offers this additional layer that lets us associate certain pieces of CSS code with individual components. And the way it works is pretty clever. You write your HTML or your Razor code inside of your Razor component. And for example, you may have an H1 tag inside of your markup, and you might want to set the color of that H1 tag. Well, what Blazor does is it will take and assign kind of a GUID or a unique identifier onto that, that H1 tag at compilation time. And it will also look at the CSS associated with that and add a selector that corresponds to that same HTML. And it does this at runtime. And it's generated at runtime as well. Like this is all a runtime feature. So even if somebody was trying to maliciously style something that they weren't supposed to be styling, they wouldn't be able to guess what that GUID number is going to be generated as the next time the application is built. So there's really no way to override these on purpose. So the way that Blazor gets these associations is you create your component, and then you create a CSS file with the same name as the component, and just add the CSS suffix on the end of it. So counter.razor, counter.razor CSS, those get combined together, and then it generates this output. So when should we use CSS isolation with Blazor? It's good when you need to isolate the CSS for a specific component. What it's not good at is if I want to globally style something. So don't use it if you're going to globally style or set up a theme for your application, because you may want to override that theme at some point, and CSS isolation is going to restrict you from doing that. If you're doing a new project, a new Blazor project, try CSS isolation out and see how it works and experiment with it. That's a good time to try it out. One thing you don't want to do, though, is if you have CSS code that's perfectly fine and working in a legacy application that maybe you migrated to Blazor, or you started a Blazor application 5 years ago and it's working well, if it's not broke, don't fix it, right? Don't use it for the sake of it being a new feature and you want to try it out in a production application. If you need to restrict the style of a component for some reason, so people don't accidentally overwrite the style of it, or you need to manage the theme of the application very tightly, this is where it works well. There's also a feature of CSS isolation that's called the deep selector. And this is when you have a component that has a parent-child relationship, and you need to affect the style of the child element. And you get this whenever you use the child content render fragments. So if I have inside of my component an H2 tag that goes into that child content, and I need to style that from the parent, you have to actually escape into it using this deep selector. So if I want to style child content, I need to use that deep selector. Otherwise, the CSS isolation, it can't see it because it's not in scope, and it just doesn't get applied. So the deep selector will help you break out of the isolation enough to get to child elements and style them. Now, I did notice something when I was writing some code one day, and I needed a bunch of these deep selectors. Like if you see yourself writing many deep selectors on top of a component, chances are that you might be missing an opportunity to abstract another component out and make that an individual component. So you're putting this arbitrary HTML code into some child content over and over again and writing these deep selectors, and maybe those two things just need to be combined into a component themselves. So look for abstraction opportunities if you see yourself writing a whole lot of deep selectors. This is a more complex topic here. So we've got two different technologies we talked about that do opposite things. We've got the Sass compiler that is great for making application-wide theming, global theming for your entire app. It generates CSS code from one or many Sass files, and it's not very useful with CSS isolation. Now we'll talk a little bit about that, and I'll try to answer the questions that folks had a couple days ago. That hopefully they joined here. If you're here, just hit me up in chat. Let me know you came, because I want to try to answer this in detail for you. Oh, a couple of us are here. I did see it now. So nice to see Chris, you joined. So we'll get into detail on that, when CSS isolation and when Sass work and how they can be balanced in Blazor. So we have at one end of the spectrum that global styling, and Sass has a big play in that. And then number 3 here, we have the opposite end, like CSS isolation all the way, we're not letting any of our developers control any of the theming unless they touch source code, like on that component's CSS. Like we have to recompile the application to get CSS changes. So that there's like two complete far ends of the spectrum here. And then there's the middle ground. And I'm going to show you how we can kind of get a sliding scale between this number 1 and number 3 as much as you would like, depending on how you want to architect your application. So that's what I'm going to talk about with scope management. One of the fundamental things we're going to need to understand before we talk about scope management is CSS custom properties. And the reason we need CSS custom properties is not only are they going to allow us to get a little creative with some of the code we write here, but they're going to allow us to write variables without the need of Sass. Sass and CSS isolation don't work very well together because the way CSS isolation is set up, there's a CSS file for each individual component. And those components might be scattered between different folders throughout the application. They could even be in other assemblies in Blazor class libraries and whatnot. So the way Sass works is usually there's a single point of entry, and then that file will call out for dependencies or other smaller Sass modules that then get pulled in and compiled to a final output. So with the Sass compiler, we would have to make note of every single one of those CSS or Sass files that is called out for each individual component. So you'd have like a giant manifest or mapping file if you wanted to do that. And Sass actually doesn't have a feature where it will like scan a directory and just compile all of the Sass that it finds, because the way CSS works, again, it's that cascading behavior. So if you were to try to go in and just like scan a directory for Sass files and compile them, the order of operations can greatly affect the output that has. So you can see what kind of chaos that might cause if you just kind of, scanned a directory and depending on how it got sorted out, you get a different CSS output. So that's actually not a thing that Sass does or can really do. There are some projects out there that's made attempts at doing it, but you're going to probably shoot yourself in the foot trying to do something like that. So I like to try to stick with web standard technology as much as I can, and then use these other techniques like Sass when there's not an option available. But thankfully, we have CSS custom properties, which allow variables natively in CSS without any other tooling. So CSS custom properties are actually also referred to as variables. It does the same thing. It means the same thing. And they follow the same rules as CSS. So they cascade, they override each other, and they can be set to different scopes depending on where they're applied. They don't require any third-party tools to compile them. They're a web standard tech. They can be modified at runtime, which is nice. That's something we can't do with Sass. So Sass has a wonderful feature of being able to use properties and do a lot of really creative things with them. But we have to run the Sass compiler to get an output, and the browser doesn't do that on its own. So we can't do that at runtime. So the part of the theming here where I'm changing the actual theme of the application is utilizing those Sass or CSS variables, and it's able to modify the values at runtime and change the theme of the application. So on the right-hand side here, you can see how we get and set variables. So to set a variable, we use this double dash notation, and then the name of the variable or the property that we want to create. And then whatever comes on the right-hand side is the value. To get the variable, we call out the property that we want to set that value to. So in this instance, we're going to set something to the color variable, and then we'll go retrieve it using the var function. So we set foo here to black, and then we're going to retrieve the value of black from it and set it to the color. If you want to apply a variable globally, we use the root shadow DOM selector. And you can actually apply these at the element level as well using specific selectors. So if I had an element on my page with a class of Baz, I could set I could set a variable up just inside of that selector. And notice they're set to the same name. So inside of Baz, we would override the color and change it to white, but globally the color would stay black. So only inside of elements with that class would we get the color black. There's another way of controlling scope, and that's using parameters in Blazor. So this is one of the easier ways to pass some options to components and break out of that CSS isolation mode. And this allows us to target like an API with our theming of our components. And this can be really handy if you have a component that has many different looks to it. A button is a great example. So a button might have different states that you want to put it in to convey different meanings. For example, if you have a delete button, you might want to have a danger class on it that specifies like a red color. Or you might want to have like an OK or commit or success color. And this is really easy to do. You simply use a little bit of Razor code and set up a parameter for whatever the option is that you want to send in, and then just append it to the CSS class on the element inside that component. You would have to write CSS code for each specific state or theme that you want to represent with that component. But this gives you a way to open up an API and allow developers to have some control over the look and feel of that component. So this isn't allowing them to set any global values, but it does let them at the instance level set at least some sort of theming up with a component. Now we're going to get into the complex bit. What I found really interesting is I could marry CSS isolation and CSS variables in the scoping mechanism that they have to do what is essentially like we have scope within C# with public and private and global static variables. So what we can do with CSS variables and CSS isolation is we could set up where we set a value at the root level, and this is a global value for the entire application. And I called it public color here just so you could understand the scope in terms of how we might define it in C# code. So this is publicly declared at the global level, and we could set it to blue. I could have a component that has an element in it with a CSS class on it, and I called that one component scope. And inside of that component scope, I could have a private color variable. That private color variable might call out to the public color variable. And I can also set up a default value in case none is provided at the global level. So this is very interesting here because if I don't set this public color, then the component will have the value of white. If I do set it, for example, here it's blue, the component will then take the color blue. So not only can I set different levels of scope, but I can even set default values. So I could not publish the global color variable here, I could leave it commented out. I could leave it in documentation. That could be a backup plan in case maybe the site needs to be rebranded. Maybe your company acquires another company or gets acquired and you have to change branding. That happens a lot in the world that we live in. So you could reserve this root variable for an override to override all of the styling for certain components that subscribe to this public color variable. Another thing that I could do, if I wanted to set a theme at the instance level, I could also set a very narrow scope. I could even go so narrow as to set it as an inline style, which would override any of the values that you see here. So what's really interesting about this is I can set the theme of a component globally. I can set a default theme. I could set it privately, and I can set it at the per instance level of the component as well. And that lets me do interesting things like this, where I can change the look and feel of a component right at runtime. Now, you might notice the colors of the text. I may have broke it, actually. The text is staying black. There should be some code in there to change the color of, oh, there it goes. Now it's working. That was odd. It seemed to be stuck there for a moment. But the color of the text and the background of the color are trying to stay where there's at least some contrast between the two. And there's a little bit of both CSS code and C# code running at runtime here to do that. So I'm leveraging all of the features of Blazor, CSS isolation, all of the web standard technology of CSS custom variables, and a little bit of data binding within Blazor to allow me to do this. So we're binding in real time to what is essentially setting the inline style for that component. Now, inline styles we kind of frowned upon for quite a while in the web world, but they're kind of making a little bit of a comeback thanks to CSS variables. The reason for that is we used to put a lot of inline styles in before CSS was really even a thing. And for example, if I set just a color to red or something inside of an inline style, that was then impossible to change the color of because of the specificity of style overriding all of everything else that comes before it. The interesting thing about using a variable here is that anything inside of the div that uses that variable gains the value that we set here. So what's nice here is I don't have something that's really hard-coded anymore, which was the problem with CSS, or the problem with inline styles, is that it was hard-coded. Now, instead, I have this variable that I'm just setting here, and anything that's using that variable gets that value from it. So that's how this component here actually works. Is it's got an inline style for a size variable and a color variable, and we're using the Blazor data binding to make that reflect the colors that I'm picking in the size that I'm picking here. This is also the same technique that I'm using to make the light and dark theme switch for the entire website. So if I were to go into an inspect mode here, and we'll try to get the outermost element of the application. And let's try, I want to make this nice and big so you can all see it. I'll try to dock it here for a minute, and we'll zoom in nice and big on that element. This is the outermost div of the application. And that outermost div is receiving an inline style that has all of the variables that are required to theme the application. And when I come down and I toggle this box here, a different set of variables is applied to that outer div. And because it's the outermost div on the application, the outermost element on the application, anything beneath that that element gets the values from that inline style. So that's how I accomplish that light and dark and high contrast mode theming there, is I'm just applying it to the outside value in the application. We can also do things like setting this up to automatic. This is kind of a cool thing that the browser can do these days. And I can come into my personalization here. Let's see, I have to do the theme. There we go, themes and settings in Windows. If I were to choose a dark theme, the application automatically picked up that change and set up the variables it needs for that. So the browser has detection in it. This is a built-in feature on the browser. And I'm just tapping into that feature. It's a web standard thing now to be able to ask the browser, what is the user's color preference? And it will actually reach into the system, depending on what device you're running on, and find those color theme settings and then report back to the browser and say, hey, this person is set up with a dark mode or a light mode. Generally, that works on Mac OS and iOS and Android and Windows. When you're doing a lot of this functionality with CSS styling inside of Blazor, you might find yourself writing if statements, like if some flag is set, then apply some CSS rule, and you end up compiling these long strings of CSS code. Even worse, if you're doing something with inline styles, you might have to set those up, and they're a bit more verbose than just class names are, because you have a property and a value. So they're kind of like a key value pair. So I wrote a small utility that helps make sense of this, and it's just a chainable API that wraps around a simple struct and builds out the CSS or style, inline style that you want to render. So in this instance here, the style that we, class we want to render out, we call in CSS Builder. And this is the utility that I wrote. By default, it always has this value. So it will always have the value of item 1. I might optionally want to add another class on. So I'm going to say, I want to add item 2 to this string, but I only want to do it when some flag is set in my system. So I can say when some value is true, we'll go ahead and add item 2. Now this when can be a Boolean flag. It can be a predicate or a function that just returns true or false. A lot of options available here. And then I can keep doing this and chaining these together, and then adding classes on as well that don't have conditions. And then the final result of this method chain here is to render a single class string that's item 1, 2, and 4, and it's going to skip 3 because the when value is set to false. This is super handy if you have components that have different states that interact with each other. Maybe you have a disabled state, and when it's disabled, one or more of these values gets turned off. You can also nest CSS builders within each other. So if you had a top level item that said when it's disabled, it's going to disable all of the classes beneath it, you can embed these things and nest them. It's very, very flexible, and it's actually very simple code under the covers that's doing it all. It's just really a nice syntactic sugar more than anything. It's all written with structs and super fast to process in .NET. Style Builder does the same exact thing. Style Builder just takes two parameters. One is the property and the other is the variable. And what's nice about Style Builder is it's going to append everything together with the colon and semicolon and spaces appropriately. So you don't have to think about writing out these concatenations and getting all of the delimiters correct when you write your final style output. This does it all for you, and there's a lot of API stuff in there to help make this really easy, and it has the ability to turn things on and off, just like the Style Builder does, or CSS Builder does. So that one's Blazor Component Utilities and CSS and Style Builder. You can find that up on GitHub, completely free to use and open source. And then finally, let's talk a little bit about frameworks. And we're actually going to talk about that next, Chris. Chris says, would you recommend us compile Telerik with CSS or use Theme Builder? We'll talk a little bit about what each one of those things is, and I can answer that question directly. So let's talk a little bit about Tailwind and Bootstrap, and then we'll talk about Telerik and what we do. So Tailwind is a very popular CSS framework that's out there. It does have some commercial aspects to it. They do sell templates and components. Their definition of component is a little bit different than ours at Progress. Components to Tailwind are more like widgets or multiple components that fulfill like a scenario, very specific scenario. But they do sell on top of Tailwind itself. Their abstraction model, I do not care for myself. That's a very opinionated thing, but the code that you write with Tailwind, in my opinion, ends up looking like the older inline styles that I talked about us, trying to get away from. And you find all of these utility classes that can get a bit verbose, and they all get injected directly into your HTML, which makes it a little bit hard to process mentally when you're looking at this stuff. So you get things like P1 and M4. These are padding and margin, and then background colors that have the color name embedded in them. All things that I personally think are bad practice, it seems to do. And a lot of these classes are one-to-one values within CSS itself. So you're essentially just trading out where you're writing your CSS. And with Tailwind, you're writing it in your HTML instead of in a CSS file. Some people really love this stuff though. So if it's working for you, then more power to you, use it. It also does require a third-party build system. They have a custom CLI that they provide, which I think uses post CSS under the hood. And it does require JavaScript for any kind of customization. So there is that. There's also Bootstrap. It's been around for quite some time. It is also free to use. They do upsell on some theming stuff. So there are themes that you can buy from them. So they do have a way to make some money there. They do have some JavaScript-based components, not quite a lot of them, but there's a decent amount there. Their abstraction is a little bit different. They're more of a utility class. I find it pretty handy at like prototyping and things like that. Don't use it as much anymore today as I used to. They optionally have Sass as their build system as of, this still says beta, but 5 is out. But it is optional, and it does help with customization and trimming if you are using it. So I do recommend it if you're already using Bootstrap. You might as well add Sass to the mix. And then the company I work for, Progress Software, we have the Telerik UI for Blazor, and it has quite a bit of theming capabilities. Since we have some folks here that are using it, I'll get into some of the more fine-grained details of it. With Telerik UI for Blazor, we can not only theme our components globally. We kind of have that middle ground that I talked about. Remember, I had the chart up of 1, 2, and 3, like 1 being everything is global. You can style stuff from CSS or SAS, and the entire application gets rethemed. You could do that with Blazor. You also have the opposite, where you can set things at the instance level of a component. And you can also use that kind of button example where the button has multiple ways of rendering as well. So developers can choose how to change the look and feel of things through properties. This can be helpful if you need to maybe set a button with an error theme on it, then it becomes red, and you can have that for cancel or warning or delete, stuff like that. And then you can even go super custom with it and set up where maybe I wanted to create a circle button. And this is a custom theme that I added for my button. And the way these properties work is they are, let's see if it'll let me jump in. Oh, it did. Good. I was worried this is an iframe to set this up. I was worried it wasn't going to let me see the code for it. But the way we render out our styles is we have classes here, and then the property gets passed off and namespaced. So you'll see this K rounded custom. So on my component, I have a button. And if I go back to the code here, let's see, there's the button. And on the rounded property or parameter on the Telerik button, I've set that to a string of custom, and that string custom gets concatenated into the normal namespacing of the properties that form the theme for the button. So what that does, we'll go back to this mode here and look at the rendered button again. And you'll see K rounded custom. So K rounded is the normal name for that property. And then custom is my custom value I passed in as a parameter on that instance of the component. It gets all concatenated together, and then I can write CSS code to target that. So I have a way of adding customized values at an instance level as well. I see the question, how is Blazor working with Fluent UI? And is there some default components already? I will get to that in just a moment. I'm going to break out into the web here for a minute. Sorry, there we go. The Zoom tools keep overlaying on top of my browser. So with Telerik, we have the ability to globally theme things a couple ways as well. So if we wanted to build a global theme for our application, we could pick up SAS and just use SAS. If we're used to coding things completely in SAS code, we're comfortable there setting up values, we could do that. We could also go to Theme Builder. And what Theme Builder offers excuse me for one moment. Let me try. Oh, I was in the wrong browser. What Theme Builder offers is a GUI way of building a theme. So this is something that we have that is very unique to us. And it works with any of our component libraries, whether you have Kendo UI and you're using JavaScript, or you're using Telerik UI for Blazor. And if I wanted to create a new theme for my application, I could come in here and create a new theme. Let's see, depending on which version or which tier of licensing you have, you can create multiple projects. It looks like this is one of the lower end instances here. So I'll go ahead and delete that project and add a new one. And then we could start at any of these base themes. And I'm still going to get to the Fluent UI question. And while I've still got it in the back of my mind here, we do have a Fluent theme for Telerik UI for Blazor as well. That's pretty interesting. So you could use all of our 100+ Telerik UI components with that Fluent theme applied to them. But if you want to just do a complete customization, I would say either grab the default, or if you're already using Bootstrap, I see that, Chris, you're already using Bootstrap, so we could take a look at that. And then you give the project a name, hit create, and then it's going to give you a preview of all of those components that are in the Telerik UI library. What's nice is you get an editor that you can go in and not only see the theme live, but you can make changes to it in real time as well. So if I wanted to change the primary color, I could come over and just select the swatch here and pick another color from my palette here. If you've seen, get a little slow connection today. If you've seen my personal website and branding, you'll know that I like the color orange. So we could come in here and pick an orange color for the primary color of the application. All of the buttons and appropriate things that match that variable get changed. Now, these are all Sass variables, Chris. So all of these Sass variables, I can override, I can add additional variables here as well. And then when I'm done, I can hit export. And export is going to give me a zip file that has both the CSS code that's completely compiled already, or I can have the Sass code, and I can copy that Sass code into my project, let CI/CD run the Sass compiler, or however my Sass compiler is set up. There's also just the token CSS, which is, we'll drop that in Visual Studio Code. And in Visual Studio Code, we can see that that is just all of the variables. All the variables get output to this file. So most of the time, what I'm just doing is taking the values from this and putting them in my project and committing that and letting it build that Sass theme out. Now, so it says we currently compile Bootstrap with certain overrides to meet ADA standards. Telerik themes, theme builder seems to help in this regard. Another thing that's interesting about the Bootstrap aspect of this is if you're using Bootstrap for theming and you're using Sass as well, if you add the Bootstrap theme for Telerik and you override a color, it will map to the Bootstrap's equivalent color and override it as well. So if I override the color of a Telerik button, if I'm using the Bootstrap button for something in my application, it will also receive the theming. So in this instance, I changed it to a gold color. All of my Bootstrap buttons and all of my Telerik buttons would both be gold. Okay, so that's a benefit of using Sass with Bootstrap and the Telerik UI Sass files as well. So hopefully that answered your question. I'll try to get to this Fluent UI question now. Fluent UI, let's see. This is a set of components that is being developed within Microsoft. I don't know how many people Microsoft has working on this right now. It's lost a little bit of its momentum. You do see that it is regularly updated. They are still working on it. I think it's a very small team that's working on it right now, but they are pretty active. It's just not a very big team. They do have some Blazor components as part of this library, and this would be I'm trying to find the live site. There is a live site that you can view off of this demo site. Now, I'm not going to pretend to be much of a Fluent UI expert. I do know they have some stuff out there. I believe it is written in JavaScript, though. I think they're using some wrappers for this, which tend to not offer the best performance. So we'll see. Again, it's something that's early in development, not a big team working on it. But there are some components out there that you can check out. So this would be the website that you want to go to. Marcelo was the one that asked this. I'll put the link in there for you, so you can see that. It's taking quite a while to load. I'm not sure what the issue is there, if it's my internet or something with their site, but it seems to be hung up at 99%. But they do have an interactive kind of site that lets you try out some of those Fluent UI components. They don't have the library that we do with the Telerik components. So there's some base stuff in there. There's like a basic grid and some input components. It's been a little bit since I've looked at it, so I can't really do it justice off the top of my head. And it won't load, so I can't really show it in too much detail, but I sent you the link there, Marcelo, so you can check it out in detail if you'd like. Marcelo says, I saw their port of React, Fluent UI and Blazor. They dropped and are now working on this Fluent Blazor. Yeah, so I try to stay unbiased on this one, but I probably know a little too much. It's going to move slowly. That'll be kind of the best way I can phrase it. There's a company like Microsoft, they need to make money on things, and they do that through Azure. And UI Components isn't selling Azure subscriptions, so you're not going to see a big effort on this, in my opinion. That's just my opinion. And again, I may want to ask other sources. I'm trying to be unbiased as I can, but that's what I've witnessed with that. It's very passionate people that are working on it mainly as a passion project, and there's not a lot of company sponsorship behind it from what I can tell. So it may be slow moving, but use what components are there. If you need to add some additional things to it, like I said, we have themes that match it. So there's always a way to supplement the things that are missing. It's interesting to watch, though. I do know that they are working on it. Fast is another interesting thing that they're doing in context of this. You mentioned that as well. Fast is a UI suite that, in my opinion, is trying to boil the ocean. It's very interesting. It's very complex, though, what they're trying to do with it. And they have this whole design system idea behind it that not sure how many people need it. And then the customization requires TypeScript. So you get into these situations. Again, I'm a huge fan of web standard technology. I say that all the time. Things like, looks like, did my app stop running here? There we go. Things like CSS variables, I think, are just really, really useful, and they're built right into the browser, and I don't need compilers. I don't need tooling to add those things to my application. The browser just understands it. And when you have things, SAS, I love SAS, but again, it requires a third-party tool to get it working. Even though it's not something as bad as like a plugin that we used to have with the browsers, it's still something I have to run at build time to get it to work. And every flavor of these things that is out there, we'll go back to the Tailwind and Bootstrap discussion. Tailwind uses Post CSS, which is a JavaScript-based tool, which are notorious for being slow. Bootstrap uses SAS, which compiles off of Dart SAS, which is something that's been around a while. It's pretty fast, but still a third-party thing I have to add to my pipeline and configure. And then you've got Fluent UI, which is doing its customization with TypeScript. So now there's another language on top of it and another compiler that I have to use to get my theming. So these things just add complexity sometimes. So it just depends on where you want to put your effort. Do you want to invest in web standard tech, use things like SAS that have been out there, and use an executable to do compilation? Do you want to use JavaScript pipeline? Do you already have a JavaScript pipeline? Do you want to use that for customization? Are you already big on TypeScript and have people that can translate design elements into TypeScript code to do theming? Like, it all just matters, is a matter of what your team is and what type of focus you want to have. Trying to make SharePoint Blazor work in SharePoint. That one I can't help you with, unfortunately. Let's see. So web part, it worked. Now I'm trying to adjust the CSS. Try to use Fluent UI. Let's see if that works. Yeah, I haven't fortunately done SharePoint. I haven't really ever touched SharePoint. Wasn't a big fan of it, so I tried to stay away from it. So I don't have a whole lot of input on the SharePoint stuff. I know it's come a long way. I think it's all going React or something like that, isn't it? I haven't heard the Blazor story on it yet. I haven't seen like Dan Roth or anybody talking about the SharePoint and Blazor mashup yet. Any other questions? I have some resources up here you can grab while I try to answer any more questions. If you want to put them in chat or come off and mute, feel free to ask. You can find pretty much everything at my website. If you go to my website, you will see my GitHub logo. I have some older podcasts out there. I have newer stuff on Twitch. If you want to see some of my live streams, YouTube channels, all of that you can find right off the homepage here. I try to post on my blog every once in a while, but most of my blogging is done on the Telerik website. You just find that off of the work tab here. Find all the blog posts that I've recently written at telerik.com. For the slides, if you go to my GitHub page, and I'll post this one to the group here in chat so you can all find it really easy. It's under my repositories here for CSS for Blazor developer presentation. And I will place that in chat. So you've got that there. And again, the presentation is the code. The code is the presentation. So feel free to dive into that. Check out all the CSS and SAS that's there. I make quite a bit of use of, again, I'm gonna say it one more time. Big fan of web standard tech. So all of the layouts that you see in the application here, this is all done with CSS Grid. CSS Grid is an immensely useful CSS feature. And if we dive into a couple elements here, you'll see that all of these slides, they make use of CSS Grid. And if you want to see how any of these things are laid out using CSS Grid, it's all the source code is there in CSS isolation doing that. And if you haven't played with Grid before, just jump into the the dev tools and highlight some of the elements and click on the little grid pill that's in there. It will actually highlight where all of the grid dividers are and where that's defined at. So this is like a 24 column grid for layout. And then that's what allows me to create this different colored profile here with the floating circles and things that overlap on the background. It's some clever use of it there. Some really simple use of CSS grid here is just creating a simple 2-column layout. And I've got a couple of these layouts baked in to the demo slides there. So you can just jump right in there and see how these are organized. And I actually use some of the features of setting properties like the button here to switch between some of the different grid layouts. So I have a property that swaps the left-hand, right-hand column, 2-column layout, and then there's another flag that removes the extra column or moves it to the bottom. So there's some additional things that you might spot as you go through some of the files inside of the project. So again, you'll find all of the components, all of the little coded examples here under components. And then there's layouts. This is like the top level stuff that lays out the main part of a slide and what defines that slide. And then the individual slides themselves make use of all of the layout components. So each one of these slides uses something from here to make that visible on the screen. So if we were to go into, say, the SAS slide, which is one of the first ones there, this is the how to install SAS slide. You'll see it has a content and a side region here. And if we look at a content slide, you'll see that the content slide has a CSS isolation file with it. We have a div, an article, and an aside. And in here we have a div that sets up the grid with some white spacing, and then the aside, and this defines the grid rows and all of that stuff. So dig into those, have some fun with it, do a little discovery and see how things are implemented.
Hey, on that same content slide, please show the CSS builder. After I have been using that for a while in a couple of projects, and that's an amazing tool. I think that everyone should make use of it, especially if they are doing conditionals for a class here and there. So
yeah, that's a good point. Thank you. So the CSS builder utility that I talked about, I actually make use of it in a couple places. And so there is a flag in here that says the aside's going to be on the left, or the aside's going to be on the bottom. And then the CSS builder, what it does is it looks at those flags and it says, if it's on the right, we're going to append this class. If it's on the left, we'll append that class. If it's on the bottom, we'll append that one. So depending on which of these is set to true, it will render this class. And then that class corresponds to some code that places the column either on the right hand, left hand, or bottom. So it's just applying some CSS grid code to it. And what's really cool about CSS grid, you can move things around the grid. So you might see something like this, where I'm defining how many rows it spans and what row it shows up on. Stuff like that lets you move elements around the grid without having to redefine the source order of the elements in there. Thanks, Chris. Look forward to talking to you all again. And if you need anything, just reach out to either Joe or I, and we can follow up with you. I know we're going to do some theme builder stuff, so I know we're excited about that. So appreciate the conversation in both directions. So yeah, all the code in here for the slides does exactly what is defined, in the presentation. So you will find multiple examples. If there weren't enough in the actual presentation, there's much, much more if you dig into the code and check out what's going on there. I think that's it for me, unless there's more questions. I'd be happy to stick around and answer for a few minutes.
Yeah, thanks a lot for the presentation. Definitely it's an amazing presentation. And I was actually, while you were doing the talk, I was trying to see, hey, why are we not seeing the browser in the slides? I was like, that's a it's a pretty cool app, definitely. So I personally, guys, have to say that I have used the CSS builder a lot. So
yeah, it can be a really helpful utility. The application that runs here, if you get a chance to look, there's let's see, the index page is kind of the entry point. And then all the slides are defined kind of within there. The slide container itself is where the kind of I don't even want to say magic. It's really not that clever. There's a little bit of binding on the key down event. And it's just detecting the left and right arrow, and that's moving me from one slide to the next. And then the container has a cascading value that keeps track of which slide you're on. So all it's doing is incrementing a counter. I mean, this is, for all intents and purposes, is the counter component, but using the key up and down. And it's using the index of that counter to move from slide to slide. And the reason you don't see the browser is I just hit the full screen button.
Nice.
And the presentation was written, or the CSS code for the presentation was written to kind of best view that at 1920 by 1080 or larger. So if you go to like smaller screen sizes, it might look a little weird, but it was written to be as full screen as I could possibly get it for conferences that use projectors, things like that. So when you hit, you might actually see, if you're using the browser, you might actually see things fall off the page a little bit with the Explorer bar open. So I wanted it to look like a PowerPoint presentation. So it's actually built to be viewed best at full screen without that browser bar up there. So I always put it in full screen mode to remove that bit of it, so I don't fall off the end of the page.
Nice. I might borrow that for another session. That looks pretty awesome.
I mean, a lot of the work's already done there. We've got several different layouts that you can use and a couple different column settings that you can put in there. The real tricky ones are the overview pages. The CSS code on those can get a little complex, where I've got things turned 90 degrees on their side, and there's quite a few different columns and stuff set up in here. But it's all doable. And if you want to take the slide deck and retheme it, that's going to be the easiest thing. Is all of the values are right in the app CSS file here. So if you wanted to come in and set up some different theming, let's see, we actually build those. My mistake. I build those off of there it is. Sorry, it's an app SAS. I used SAS to set this up. But all of the theme values are set in here. So if you wanted to come in, maybe you don't like the color orange, you could come in and set that to red and rerun the app, and it should all be a different color now. Looks like the compiler didn't kick off, but you get the idea.
Yeah, nice. Yeah, and I also really like the part where you were mentioning about CSS isolation, that, hey, if you're starting a new project, you can go for it, because we have definitely started some projects that is faster and easier for us that we are not a CSS expert to just put it there, make sure that only apply for this component, and then after a little bit of work, there is come the front end guy, and he actually take and make it a global CSS and do SAS and do everything else. So we have teams and everything else. So, all right, guys. Any other questions?
All right. It was nice being able to talk to all of you, and good luck with your Arizona meetup.
Hey,
Thanks for
a lot.
having
Yeah,
me as a
next month
speaker.
we'll be talking about Blazor and AI. So excited about that one.
Interesting. Blazor and AI. Do you know who the speaker is?
Hopefully it will be Michael Washington.
Oh, okay. Tell
Yeah.
him I said hi. And
I will. I will.
Michael Washington's a good dude. Like him.
Yeah,
He's
his site Blazor help website is an amazing resource for everyone as well who wants to learn more about
Blazor book out there as well.
Yes.
It's got a great book if you get a chance. Make sure you check it out. I think it's this one, Introduction to Building Web Applications with Blazor. Yeah, there we go. Yeah. You got a good speaker lined up. Like I said, tell him I said hey.
Definitely will do. Hey, thanks everyone for joining. Hey, thanks a lot, Ed. I really appreciate your time. And the talk was amazing. So thanks a lot. Hey, see you guys next month.